Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, not to the epic battles or the grand monuments, but to the quieter, more mundane corners of the Roman Empire, specifically to its economic heart. Imagine a bustling Roman street market, the air thick with the smell of roasting lamb and the sound of haggling voices. You're not here to buy a clay pot or a bushel of olives. Instead, you're standing in front of a living, breathing person, and you're about to negotiate their price. It's a surreal, unsettling thought, one that feels utterly alien to our modern world. And yet, this was the reality of the ancient world. You probably won't survive this entire journey without dozing off, but that's the goal, isn't it? This isn't about adrenaline, it's about the quiet hum of history. A history so vast and detailed it can lull you right to sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin our exploration with a simple, yet profound question. How much did a Roman slave cost? The answer, as with most things in the ancient world, is complex and fluid, depending on 1,000 different variables. You couldn't just walk into a market and buy a standard slave for a set price. Think of it like buying a car today. You've got the beaten-up old sedan that's just a mode of transportation, or you have the brand new luxury vehicle with all the bells and whistles. The value of a slave was a reflection of their individual characteristics, a grim calculus of age, health, education, and skills. The cheapest slaves were often those captured in war or born into slavery, with no particular training or exceptional qualities. A healthy male field worker, for example, might fetch around 1,000 to 2,500 sesterces. To give you some context, a Roman legionary earned about 900 sesterces a year, so the cost of a basic slave was roughly equivalent to 1 to 3 years of a soldier's pay. A soldier who was, by the way, often the very person responsible for capturing the people who became slaves. It's a strange kind of circle, isn't it? The price could skyrocket for those with special skills. An educated Greek tutor, a skilled accountant, or a talented artist could be worth a fortune. These were the luxury models, the human equivalents of a high-end sports car. A Greek boy with a good education could easily fetch 10 times the price of a common laborer, sometimes reaching 10,000 sesterces or more. And a beautiful young woman with musical talent could go for even higher sums. It wasn't just about their skills, though their physical appearance, their health, their temperament, it all factored into the final price. You can almost see the buyers in your mind's eye, prodding and inspecting, treating a person like a prize-winning show animal. It's a chilling image, but it was a completely normal transaction. The most expensive slaves, though, were a category all their own. A trained gladiator, a skilled physician, or a famous architect could command astronomical prices, sometimes tens of thousands of sesterces. Think of these as the bespoke, one-of-a-kind purchases, valued for their rarity and specialized utility. The historian Pliny the Elder, for example, recounts a story of a slave so skilled in mathematics that his price was almost beyond measure. This highlights a key aspect of Roman slavery. It wasn't just brute force, it was a multifaceted institution that integrated every level of society, from the lowest field hand to the most refined intellectual. The Roman elite saw no contradiction in owning a highly educated person, using their brilliance for their own gain while denying them the most basic human rights. Historians still argue whether the price of slaves fluctuated more based on supply or demand. Did a sudden influx of captives from a successful military campaign cause prices to drop? Or did the constant need for labor keep the market consistently high? The consensus seems to be that both played a role, but the sheer volume of military conquests was a major driver. Every time a new territory was subdued, a fresh wave of human beings was funneled into the empire's vast labor pool, driving down the prices for the less skilled, more common slaves. A good military campaign was not just a victory for Rome, it was a fire sale on human lives. As you continue your imaginary stroll through the Roman Forum, the clinking of coins becomes the dominant soundtrack. That sound wasn't just for bread or pottery, it was the chilling melody of human beings being bought and sold. Let's get down to the brass tacks, or more accurately, the bronze, silver, and gold of it all. The primary coins in circulation were the bronze as, the silver denarius, and the gold aureus. A denarius was worth 16 asses, and an aureus was a whopping 25 denarii, or 400 asses. These were the denominations that a human life was measured in. The average price of a healthy, unskilled male slave hovered around 1,000 to 2,500 sesterces, which were silver coins valued at a quarter of a denarius. So, a slave would cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 625 denarii. Or if you were a Roman aristocrat with a taste for gold, about 10 to 25 aurae. It's hard to wrap your mind around a human being's value being so neatly pegged to a handful of coins, isn't it? The price wasn't just a single number, though it was a whole range, like a modern car dealership offering a base model and then tacking on thousands of dollars for upgrades. The upgrades for a slave were their skills and physical attributes. A young, strong, and healthy male slave was the foundation of the market. He could be put to work in the fields, in a workshop, or on a construction crew, and his value was his raw, physical output. A common example of a quirky tidbit you might come across in the historical record is the mention of a slave who was a particularly good shoemaker or stonemason. Such a skilled artisan would be worth a premium. We see this today with specialized trades. But imagine that skill being something you owned. A good Roman general might have a scribe who could read and write Greek, and that slave's value would be exponentially higher than a simple field hand. The more unique and valuable the skill, the more the slave became a luxury good rather than a basic commodity. And yet, for all this cold economic calculation, there was a strange hypocrisy. While the Romans treated slaves as property, they also recognized their humanity on some level. A contradiction that historians still debate. For instance, a Roman citizen who freed a slave became their patron, and the former slave became their client. The freedman still owed certain duties and respects to his former master. It was a bizarre, liminal space. You were no longer property, but you weren't fully your own person either. You had a foot in both worlds, a shadow of your former life still hanging over you. This is a far cry from, say, a modern-day car, which doesn't come back to your house to do chores after you sell it, unless, of course, you've forgotten to pay off the loan, but I digress. The actual transaction itself would be a messy affair, full of shouting and gesturing. The slave would often be displayed on a raised platform, a grim pedestal for human goods. You'd examine them for physical defects, ask about their temperament, and try to get a feel for their overall health. There was a legal concept known as noxia, where a master was liable for any harm or damage their slave caused, so a buyer had to be careful. The buyer might ask to see the slave's teeth, feel their muscles, or even prod them to see their reactions. It's a stomach-turning image, but it was a regular part of Roman commerce. The fact that the price of a person could be debated so casually and at such length is one of the most jarring aspects of Roman history. The value of a human being, a son, a daughter, a father, was simply the outcome of a negotiation in a dusty marketplace. Once the coin had clinked and the transaction was complete, the newly acquired slave's life was forever changed. But their journey into servitude had often begun long before. Where did Rome get all these human beings? Anyway, you might assume it was mostly from wars, and you'd be right. Military conquest was by far the largest single source of slaves for the Roman Empire. When a legion swept through a foreign land, they didn't just take territory, they took people. The vast, by often brutal, armies of Rome brought back hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of captives from conquered regions like Gaul, Greece, and parts of Africa. These new arrivals, stripped of their homelands and their freedom, were often the most miserable and desperate class of slaves. They were seen as spoils of war, a grim bonus for a victorious campaign, and they had little to no protection under Roman law. Their new life began on a long, brutal march back to Rome, a journey that would break the spirit of even the strongest among them. But conquest wasn't the only source. One of the more unsettling origins of Roman slavery was debt. A Roman citizen who fell into serious debt could, in some cases, sell themselves or their children into slavery to satisfy their creditors. It was a last resort, a desperate measure to avoid utter ruin. And it highlights a particularly cold aspect of Roman society. Your personal freedom, a concept we hold so dear, was sometimes just another asset to be leveraged. We still have debt today, of course, but you don't hear of people selling their kids to pay off a mortgage. Well, not legally anyway. This practice was, in fact, so harsh that it was eventually outlawed, but it shows how easily a person could lose everything, even their liberty. In the ancient world, a more common occurrence was the sale of children by impoverished parents, particularly when a family was large and resources were scarce. It was a bleak calculus of survival. Another major source was simply birth. A child born to a slave mother automatically became a slave, regardless of who the father was. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of servitude that helped ensure a constant supply of slaves for the empire's insatiable needs. These vernae, or homeborn slaves, often had a slightly better lot than those captured in war. They were raised within the household, often trained for specific domestic tasks, and sometimes developed a closer relationship with their masters. They might even have been given a small amount of education, though it was almost always for the master's benefit, to make them better accountants or something. Historians still argue whether being a verna was a blessing or a curse. On one hand, you avoided the horrors of the slave market, but on the other, you were born into a life with no hope of ever being truly free. It's a bit like a really bad family business you can't quit, but with no pay and no weekends off. Finally, you had the less common sources, piracy and kidnapping. The Mediterranean Sea was not a safe place, and pirates would routinely raid coastal towns, capturing anyone they could and selling them into slavery. Sometimes, this was a way to get a specific type of slave that was in high demand. For instance, a wealthy Roman might commission a pirate to bring back a skilled musician or a good cook. It was a grim black market that fueled the demand for specialized slaves. This is a bit of a fringe tidbit, but it shows how far Romans would go to get what they wanted. Think of it as a kind of bespoke service for human property, which is just about as unsettling as it sounds. So, whether you were a warrior from a defeated tribe, a debtor, a child of a slave, or a kidnap victim, the road to Rome was often paved with the loss of your freedom, having been captured, sold, or born into servitude. The next stop for many slaves was the Roman marketplace, a scene of both commerce and profound human misery. You can almost hear the cacophony, the shouts of the auctioneers, the chatter of potential buyers, the silent despair of the enslaved standing on a raised platform called the cataster. This was a grim stage where your value was calculated in plain sight. They would be forced to stand there, sometimes for hours, as prospective masters prodded and inspected them as if they were livestock. A sign hung around the neck of each slave, detailing their origin, skills, health, and temperament. This was the ancient world's version of a price tag and a specification sheet. A cold list of traits that reduced a human being to a set of attributes. You can imagine the irony, a sign that might read Greek philosopher, fluent in Latin and mathematics, and another that simply says strong field hand, accustomed to heavy labor, both describing people who, just months or years earlier, had been free individuals. The marketplace was not a place for subtlety. Buyers were encouraged to inspect their potential purchases meticulously. There was a legal principle, caveat emptor, or let the buyer beware, which applied just as much to humans as it did to jars of olive oil. A master could sue the previous owner if a slave turned out to have a hidden illness or a rebellious nature that wasn't disclosed. It's a strange legal reality, isn't it? A system that recognized the need for a kind of consumer protection for the buyer, but gave no protection whatsoever to the person being sold. It's a bit like buying a used car and finding out the air conditioning doesn't work, except in this case. The car has feelings and a family. This meticulous inspection was a practical necessity. A master didn't want to invest in a slave who would prove to be a liability, either because of poor health or a defiant spirit. The market was ruthless, weeding out the weak and often assigning a lower value to those who showed any hint of resistance. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is the practice of guaranteeing a slave for a certain period. Some sellers would offer a sort of warranty, promising to take the slave back if they were found to have a major fault or if they committed a grave crime within a few months of the sale. This highlights the high-risk nature of the human commodity market. A slave who was a good investment could bring in wealth for a master, but a bad slave could be a financial disaster. It shows that even within this brutal system, a form of economic logic prevailed, attempting to make the trade of human beings as safe and predictable as possible. It's a sobering thought. The idea that a person's life could be so neatly tied up in a warranty. It was a kind of buyer's insurance for something you had no right to buy in the first place. Historians still argue whether the catasta was a common sight in all Roman cities or if it was reserved for the major hubs like Rome and Ostia. Was the buying and selling of slaves a constant feature of daily life, or was it a more specialized, large-scale event? The general consensus is that while the large public auctions were a feature of the big cities, smaller sales and private transactions happened all over the empire, from tiny rural villages to bustling port towns. So, while you may not have seen a full-blown auction on every street corner, the reality of human ownership was never far away. The Roman marketplace, therefore, was more than just a place of commerce. It was a brutal stage where human dignity was put on display and sold to the highest bidder. Once a slave was purchased, their new life began, often within the structured and complex hierarchy of a Roman household. This was a world away from the brutal fields or mines. It was a universe of its own, with its own unspoken rules and a strict pecking order. You might imagine that all domestic slaves had it easy, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The Roman household, or familia, was a finely tuned machine, and every enslaved person had a specific role, from the most mundane to the highly specialized. At the top of this grim ladder were the pedagogi, or tutors, who were often highly educated Greeks. They were responsible for the intellectual and moral training of the master's children. Their status was high, and they were often treated with a degree of respect and given better living conditions. It's a strange thought, isn't it? A person who was legally property, yet also responsible for shaping the minds of the future Roman elite. Below them were the myriad of other roles, each with a Latin name that perfectly encapsulated their function. The aetriensis was the steward of the household, managing the day-to-day operations and overseeing other slaves. Then you had the cubicularius, the chamber servant, who would attend to the master in his private quarters. In the kitchen, the cocus was the cook, and a skilled cook could be worth a great deal. A quirky tidbit is that Roman law even had provisions for a slave who was a bad cook. You had the vestiarius for clothing and the calciator, who was a shoemaker. Every aspect of a Roman aristocrat's life was managed by a different enslaved person. It's a bit like a modern-day smart home, but instead of apps, every function was controlled by a person who was owned by you. This domestic hierarchy was so rigid that a slave's position often determined their quality of life. The kitchen and chamber slaves had it relatively easy compared to the poor souls who had to clean the latrines or maintain the furnaces. While some masters were kind and treated their slaves well, others were notoriously cruel. The Roman historian Seneca wrote about the difference, noting that a master who was decent would find his slaves more loyal and hard-working. This is a mainstream historical fact that reveals a glimmer of humanity in a profoundly inhumane system. The treatment of slaves was not uniform, and a lucky slave might find themselves with a master who was benevolent. It was a lottery, a grim roll of the dice that could mean the difference between a life of relative comfort and one of daily terror. Historians still argue whether the presence of so many specialized domestic slaves actually led to the decline of Roman innovation. Did the constant availability of cheap, skilled labor remove the incentive for Romans to invent machines and technologies that could replace them? The debate is a fascinating one. On one hand, why invent a water pump when you have a dozen strong slaves to carry buckets? On the other hand, the Romans were master engineers, and they did invent things like aqueducts and the Roman arch. The paradox is that they had both the intellect and the labor. It's a bit like having a calculator but choosing to do all your math in your head just because you can. The household hierarchy was a microcosm of the Roman Empire itself, a complex, stratified system built on the backs of those at the bottom, who, for all their specific skills and roles, were still just considered tools of the trade. Now, having seen the grim hierarchy of the Roman household, it's crucial to understand the fundamental concept that underpinned the entire institution. Roman law considered slaves not as people, but as property, or res. You might think of a slave as a living, breathing tool, a piece of equipment that could talk and carry out complex commands, but was ultimately no different in the eyes of the law than a chair or a cart. This is a mainstream historical fact that can be difficult to reconcile with our modern understanding of human rights. A slave had no legal personhood. They could not own property. They could not make a contract. And they could not legally marry. Any offspring they had were not their children in a legal sense. They were simply an increase in the master's property. The Roman legal system, with all its famous complexity and nuance, had a simple, brutal rule for slaves. They were objects. This legal status had profound and chilling implications for every aspect of a slave's life. If a slave was harmed, the master could seek compensation. But it was not because a person was injured, it was because the master's property had been damaged. It's a bit like someone keying your car. You wouldn't be compensated for the car's feelings, you'd be compensated for the damage to your property. A quirky tidbit is that if a slave committed a crime, their master was often held responsible, a legal concept known as nocturnal surrender. The master could either pay for the damages caused by the slave or hand the slave over to the injured party, who could then do with them as they pleased. This highlights the strange duality of a slave's legal status. They were seen as responsible for their actions, but they were not considered a legal person. It's as if your toaster suddenly decided to burn down the house, and you had to pay for it, or you could simply give the toaster to your neighbor to punish as they see fit. It's a very weird arrangement, but it was the law of the land. The lack of legal rights also meant that a master had almost total control over a slave's life. The master could punish, sell, or even kill a slave with relative impunity, especially in the early Roman Republic. While later laws were passed to curb some of the most extreme cruelties, the power imbalance was immense and overwhelmingly in favor of the master. Historians still argue whether these later laws were passed out of genuine humanitarian concern or simply to ensure the stability of the slave system. Was it a cynical move to prevent massive revolts by making conditions slightly more tolerable, or was there a true shift in Roman morality? The fact that the laws were often not strictly enforced suggests a pragmatic, rather than a moral, motive. This concept of res, or property, wasn't just a legal abstraction, it permeated Roman society. It affected everything from how slaves were bought and sold to how they were buried. A slave's tombstone would often list their master's name, not their own, a final, grim reminder of their status, even in death. This is an open, scholarly debate. To what extent did slaves develop their own social and cultural identities despite being legally considered property? There is evidence of slave networks, religious cults, and even burial clubs that were independent of their masters. It seems that while the law saw them as tools, the slaves themselves managed to forge a semblance of community and personhood in the shadows of the empire. From the relative comfort of the domestic household, we now shift our gaze to the vast, sprawling fields that fed the Roman Empire. This was where the great majority of slaves toiled, under the relentless sun and the constant threat of the overseer's whip. The business of agriculture in ancient Rome was built entirely on the backs of enslaved labor. The Roman economy was a largely agrarian one, and the immense land holdings of the senatorial elite, known as latifundia, were worked by gangs of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of slaves. A mainstream historical fact is that the expansion of the latifundia and the influx of war captives in the late Republic and early Empire created a social and economic system that relied almost exclusively on slave labor for its food production. It was a vicious cycle. The more land a wealthy Roman acquired, the more slaves he needed to work it, and the more slaves he had, the more land he could acquire. The conditions on these agricultural estates were brutal. Slaves lived in barracks, often in chains, and worked from dawn until dusk. They were fed a meager ration of grain, olive oil, and sometimes saltfish, just enough to keep them alive and productive. The work was backbreaking, ploughing fields with primitive tools, harvesting crops, and hauling water. There was little to no rest, and the overseer, often a slave himself, was tasked with ensuring maximum output. A quirky tidbit you might not know is that there were specific legal rules about how many times a slave could be whipped, not that it mattered much in practice, as many masters simply ignored the law, but it shows a weird attempt by the state to regulate cruelty while simultaneously sanctioning the ownership of human beings. It's like creating a law that says you can only kick your dog a certain number of times per day. It's still wrong, but it's a law nonetheless. The sheer scale of this human labor force is mind-boggling. It's estimated that at the peak of the empire, as much as 30% of the Italian population was enslaved. Imagine a society where almost 1/3 of the people you meet are considered property. It was a reality that permeated every aspect of Roman life, from the food on the table to the luxury goods in a villa. This raises a fascinating, and still debated, question among historians. Did this reliance on slave labor ultimately stifle agricultural innovation? Why would a landowner invest in a new ploughing machine when he could simply buy more slaves for a relatively low price? The constant availability of cheap labor acted as a disincentive to technological progress in some areas, a point that historians still argue over. It's a bit like having a house full of people to do your chores. So you never buy a vacuum cleaner or a washing machine. This agricultural system, for all its cruelty, was incredibly efficient. The immense amount of food produced by the latifundia allowed Rome to sustain its massive urban population and its legions, but this efficiency came at an immense human cost. The Roman agronomist Cato the Elder, in his work De Agricultura, even gave advice on how to get the most out of your slaves and what to do with them when they got old and became unproductive. His solution was simple and cruel: sell them off. It's a horrifying reminder that for many Romans, slaves were simply tools, and when a tool broke, you got rid of it. While life on the agricultural latifundia was brutal, it pales in comparison to the existence of slaves in one of the Roman Empire's most unforgiving environments, the mines. These dark, oppressive holes in the ground were the final destination for many slaves, particularly those who were rebellious or considered too dangerous for other forms of labor. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman economy's reliance on metal, from iron for tools to silver and gold for currency, meant a constant need for a vast, expendable workforce. The conditions were so horrific that mining was often seen as a death sentence. Slaves worked in cramped, claustrophobic tunnels, often in complete darkness, with little ventilation and the constant risk of cave-ins. The dust from the ores filled their lungs, and the work was so physically demanding that their lifespans were incredibly short, a quirky and deeply unsettling tidbit is that the Roman state often leased out its mines to private contractors. These contractors would then be responsible for providing the labor, and they had every incentive to work the slaves to death, as a dead slave was simply a cost of business that could be replaced. There was no long-term investment in the well-being of the workforce. It was a purely extractive enterprise, both for the ore and for the lives of the people who extracted it. The idea of a government outsourcing its most brutal work is a very Roman concept, a kind of bureaucratic cruelty that allowed the state to distance itself from the day-to-day horrors of slavery. This is a bit like a modern company hiring a third-party factory overseas to produce its goods, and then turning a blind eye to the working conditions. The sheer scale of these operations is staggering. The silver mines in Spain, for example, were so productive that they were a major source of Roman wealth, but every ounce of silver was bought with immense human suffering. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus described the life of a slave in the mines as a fate worse than death itself, a ceaseless torment with no end in sight. He wrote that masters would often put their most disobedient slaves in the mines because they knew they would never escape. It was a kind of living punishment, a sentence of slow, agonizing labor. This is a point that historians still argue about. To what extent did Roman citizens know the full horror of the mines, and to what extent did they choose to ignore it? Was the wealth from the mines simply too tempting to question its origin? It's a question that gets at the heart of the moral compromises made by an entire society. The legacy of the mining slaves is a dark stain on Roman history. Their labor fueled the empire, paid for the legions, and built the monuments, but they are largely anonymous. We have their names on few records, and their stories are lost to the dust of the mines they died in. Their lives were a testament to the fact that for all the glory and sophistication of Rome, it was an empire built on the most brutal kind of human exploitation. The constant threat of brutal punishment and the unending hardship of daily life meant that rebellion was never far from the minds of the enslaved. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman Empire, for all its might, lived in constant fear of slave uprisings. The most famous of these was the rebellion led by Spartacus in the 1st century BC. You've probably heard the name. He's the star of 1,000 movies and TV shows. Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator who escaped from a training school with about 70 of his fellow gladiators. This small group grew into a massive army of over 120,000 men, women, and children, who for 2 years roamed the Italian countryside, defeating several Roman legions sent to stop them. Their goal was simple: to get to freedom. The fact that a slave army could defeat the professional soldiers of Rome shows just how desperate and determined they were. The Roman response to these rebellions was swift and unbelievably cruel. After Spartacus was finally defeated and killed by the forces of Marcus Licinius Crassus, a wealthy general, a grim punishment was meted out. A quirky tidbit is that Crassus didn't just execute the survivors, he crucified 6,000 of them along the Appian Way, the major road leading into Rome. The line of crosses stretched for miles. A horrifying, undeniable message to anyone who dared to challenge the Roman order. It was a public spectacle of vengeance, a warning that the price of rebellion was a slow, agonizing death. The crucifixions were a chillingly effective form of control, a physical manifestation of the absolute power of the master class. This is a bit like a modern-day government building a 10-mile-long billboard that says, "Don't even think about it." But instead of words, it was thousands of tortured bodies. This brutal retaliation brings up an open, scholarly debate. To what extent did the threat of rebellion shape Roman policy and society? Did the constant fear of a Spartacus-style uprising lead to harsher laws, or did it push some masters towards slightly more humane treatment? Some historians argue that the fear of large-scale revolts was a powerful deterrent to unchecked cruelty, while others contend that it simply made the punishments for disloyalty even more severe. It seems that the threat of rebellion created a paradox, a deep-seated fear that led to both greater control and, in some cases, a grudging recognition of the need for some concessions to prevent a complete collapse of the system. The spectre of rebellion wasn't just limited to massive armies, it was a daily reality. A single slave who ran away was a problem, and a group of them was a minor crisis. The Romans even had a professional slave-catching service to track down runaways. It was a grim game of cat and mouse, one that shows just how fragile the Roman system was beneath its polished facade. The fact that Rome had to go to such extreme lengths to maintain control over its enslaved population is a testament to the constant, simmering resentment that existed just below the surface. For all the horrors of rebellion and the brutality of the system, a path to freedom did exist for Roman slaves, and it was called manumission. This was the legal act by which a master freed his slave, and it was a surprisingly common occurrence. A mainstream historical fact is that manumission was not just an act of kindness, it was a complex social and economic maneuver. A master might free a slave for a number of reasons, as a reward for long and faithful service, as a way to curry favor with the gods, or simply because the slave had saved enough money to buy their own freedom. A slave who was granted manumission became a freed person, or libertus, and they took on the name of their former master, a sign of their new, albeit complicated, social status. The act of manumission was often a public, ceremonial affair, a way of showing everyone that the master was both generous and powerful. The process itself was relatively straightforward. The most common form of manumission was manumissio testamento, or manumission by will. A master could write in his will that certain slaves would be freed upon his death. This was a popular option because it allowed the master to enjoy the slave's labor for their entire life and then, in a final act of benevolence, grant them freedom. It's a bit like a boss giving you a retirement party after you've worked for them your whole life, but instead of a gold watch, you get your freedom. A quirkier tidbit is the practice of manumissio censu, where a slave was registered in the census as a free person with the consent of their master. This was a more formal and official way to gain freedom, and it was considered one of the most secure forms. It's a great example of Roman bureaucracy being used for a surprisingly positive purpose, but manumission wasn't a one-way street. The newly freed person still owed a great deal to their former master, who now became their patron. Historians still argue whether this new relationship was a form of slavery light or a genuine path to a better life. The freedman was legally bound to provide a certain number of days of service to their patron each year, and they were also obligated to show them respect and loyalty. This is a fascinating, open, scholarly debate. Did the freedmen have a real choice, or were they simply trading one form of servitude for another? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. While the freedmen no longer had to endure the physical hardships of slavery, they were still tied to their former master in a web of social and economic obligations. They couldn't, for instance, get married or enter into business without the patron's approval. It was a kind of half-freedom, a liminal space between being a person and being property. The existence of manumission is a critical piece of the puzzle of Roman slavery. It shows that the system was not entirely closed. It was a grim, brutal institution, but it contained within it a glimmer of hope, a faint promise that a slave's life was not necessarily a life sentence. The glimmer of hope that was manumission didn't always lead to a life of full and complete freedom. In fact, a freed person, or libertus, occupied a strange and often difficult position in Roman society. You were no longer property, but you weren't a full citizen either. This is a mainstream historical fact that reveals the nuances of Roman social structure. The freedman's status was a bit like a perpetual probationary period. You could run your own business, own property, and even vote. But there were some pretty significant strings attached. A libertus could not hold a public office, for instance, and a freedman's children were not immediately granted full citizenship. It was a gradual process, often taking several generations for a family to fully integrate into the Roman citizenry. The most important of these social ties was the one that bound the freedmen to their former master, who was now their patron. This was a formal, legal relationship. The freedman was obligated to pay their patron a certain amount of respect, and in some cases, to perform a set number of days of service or labour for them each year. It's a bit like an ancient, legally binding version of a modern-day internship, but with a lot more personal obligation and a lot less pay. This relationship was the key to a freedman's survival and success. The patron provided protection, helped them find work, and acted as a social and political guide. In return, the freedman was expected to be loyal and helpful. A quirky tidbit is that a freedman who became wealthy and famous, like the playwright Terence, was still expected to acknowledge his patron in his public works. It was a kind of public humility, a reminder that no matter how far you rose, you still owed a debt to the person who had granted you your freedom. The economic life of a freedman was often a mix of opportunity and limitation. Many became successful merchants, craftsmen, or small business owners. The very skills they learned as slaves, from baking bread to running an accounting firm, could now be used for their own profit. This is a fascinating aspect of Roman history. The freedman class became an engine of the Roman economy, a vibrant and dynamic social group that filled the gap between the aristocratic elite and the poor, free citizens. A well-known scholarly debate is whether this freedman class, with its economic drive and ambition, was a key factor in the prosperity of the late Roman Republic and early empire. Some historians argue that their entrepreneurial spirit was a major driver of economic growth, while others contend that they were simply a convenient labor source for their patrons. The lives of the freed people are a testament to human resilience and ambition. They were, in many ways, an example of social mobility. Even if that mobility was often limited and came with a heavy price tag, they had a foot in two worlds, the grim past of their servitude and the complicated, but hopeful, future of their new lives. They were a living, breathing paradox. A perfect symbol of the Roman Empire's ability to be both incredibly cruel and, in some rare cases, surprisingly flexible. The path to manumission for many slaves was not a gift from a benevolent master, but something they had to earn. Literally, this was made possible through a practice known as the peculium, a fascinating and slightly contradictory part of Roman law. A mainstream historical fact is that a peculium was a small fund of money or property that a master allowed a slave to hold and manage. It wasn't legally the slave's property. In the eyes of the law, it still belonged to the master, but the master would allow the slave to use it as their own. It was a kind of informal savings account, a grim and hopeful way for a slave to save up enough money to buy their own freedom. The funds for a peculium could come from a variety of sources: tips from guests, small payments for services rendered, or even profits from a tiny business the master allowed the slave to run on the side. The peculium was a brilliant piece of social engineering. From the master's perspective, it was a powerful motivator. A slave with a peculium had a reason to work hard and be loyal. They had a vested interest in the success of the household or the business because it directly affected their ability to earn money. It's a bit like a modern-day performance bonus. But the ultimate bonus was freedom. This is a quirky tidbit you don't often hear about. A master might even loan a slave money from his own funds to start a peculium. It was a risky investment, but if the slave was successful and managed to buy their freedom, the master not only got the money back but also gained a loyal freedman who would owe him a lifelong debt of gratitude and service. The amount of money needed to buy freedom varied greatly, but it was often a large sum, equivalent to the slave's initial purchase price or more. For a slave to accumulate that kind of money was a monumental task, a lifetime of saving and scrimping. It shows that manumission was not just a whim, it was a serious, long-term goal that required immense discipline and hard work. Historians still argue whether the peculium was a sign of a softening of Roman attitudes towards slavery or simply a more efficient way to manage a human workforce. Did it represent a step toward recognizing a slave's humanity, Or was it just another tool of control, a way to keep slaves from rebelling by dangling a carrot in front of them? The answer, as always with Rome, is a bit of both. The peculium was a system that allowed masters to benefit from their slaves' ambition while simultaneously providing a path, however difficult, to freedom. The existence of the peculium proves that even within a brutal and rigid system, human beings found ways to exert some control over their own destiny. It was a fragile hope, a small light in a very dark world, but it was a light nonetheless. The image of a slave carefully counting their coins, a single, hopeful step toward a life they could call their own, is a powerful one. Having explored the economics of slavery and the paths to freedom, let's step into the Roman kitchen, a place where a slave's life was dictated by the culinary whims of their masters. Roman cuisine, for the elite, was a complex and lavish affair, and it was entirely managed by enslaved people. A mainstream historical fact is that a well-stocked Roman villa would have a variety of specialized cooking slaves. There was the cocus, or head cook, who was often a highly trained and skilled professional, and then a legion of assistants, from the pistores who made the bread to the pulmentarius who prepared the stews. The food they prepared was often a strange mix of the familiar and the exotic, a blend of grains and vegetables with things like flamingo tongues and peacock brains. You know, just a normal Tuesday night dinner. The preparation of these meals was a long and arduous process, and it was the slaves who bore the brunt of the work, from fetching water to butchering animals to serving the final dish. A quirky, but telling tidbit is that a Roman cook's reputation was so important that if a dinner party was a success, the master might reward his cook with a special gift or even a small sum of money for their peculium. But if the party was a disaster, the cook could face a severe punishment, sometimes even a beating. It was a high-stakes job, a position where your personal safety was tied to the taste buds of your master's dinner guests. It's a bit like a modern-day chef on a reality show, but with much more dramatic consequences for a bad review. This is a fascinating glimpse into the micro-relationships between masters and their enslaved servants, a world where the ability to make a good soufflé could save you from a world of hurt. The dining experience itself was a theatrical event, and slaves were a crucial part of the spectacle. A Roman dinner party was not just about food, it was about showing off one's wealth and status. Slaves were the living props, the silent backdrop to the feast. You would have slaves bringing in courses, pouring wine, and even entertaining the guests. This leads to a fascinating, and still open, scholarly debate. Did the presence of so many enslaved people at a Roman dinner party dehumanize the guests, making them less sensitive to the suffering of others, or did it create a kind of moral dissonance, where Romans were aware of the horrors of slavery but chose to ignore it in their daily lives? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, but the image of a wealthy Roman reclining on a couch, eating a stuffed dormouse while a silent, hungry slave stands nearby, is a powerful one for the slaves themselves. The kitchen was often a world of its own, with its own social hierarchy and rivalries. It was a place of hard work, but also a place where a skilled slave could earn a small amount of status and a better quality of life. The Roman kitchen was a microcosm of the Roman world itself, a complex, stratified system where every detail was controlled and every person, free or enslaved, had a very specific role to play. From the kitchens, we move to another Roman institution that was equally reliant on enslaved labor, the public baths. While you might think of the Roman baths as a place for all, a great social equalizer where senators and commoners mingled, the reality was that they were a complex system run almost entirely by a vast workforce of enslaved people. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman baths, from the small, local balnea to the massive imperial thermae, were not just for bathing. They were social centers, gyms, libraries, and even places for business deals, but all of this depended on the labor of slaves. You had slaves whose job it was to tend to the massive furnaces that heated the water and air, the fornicatores. These were dangerous, dirty jobs, often done in sweltering heat, and the slaves who did them were seen as among the lowest of the low. A quirky tidbit is that there were even slaves whose job was simply to hold a person's clothes while they bathed. Imagine having a job where your entire purpose was to stand around holding someone's toga and sandals. It sounds kind of silly, but it was a real and often thankless, task. These slaves were known as the capsarii, and their job was so minor that they were often given a separate, less prestigious space to work in. It's a great example of the hyper-specialization of labor in the Roman world, where even the most minute tasks were assigned to a specific person who was legally owned by someone else. A further quirk is that the theft of clothes from the capsarii was a common problem, and masters would sometimes chain their slaves to a post just to make sure they couldn't run away with the master's expensive garments. The social atmosphere of the baths brings up a fascinating, open, scholarly debate. To what extent did Roman citizens interact with the enslaved people who served them? Was there a kind of casual cruelty, where masters simply ignored the humanity of the slaves, or did a kind of personal, if unequal, relationship develop? The truth is that it was probably a mix. A Roman would interact with a bath slave on a daily basis, but they would still see them as a piece of property, not an equal. It's a bit like us interacting with a self-checkout machine. We know it's there, we know it has a function, but we don't think about the people who built it or the company that owns it. The bath slaves were the silent backdrop to Roman social life, a constant reminder that for every Roman citizen enjoying a life of leisure, there was an enslaved person making it possible. The grand, marble-lined halls and soaring ceilings of the Roman baths were an illusion, a beautiful facade that hid the grim reality of a society built on the backs of human beings. After a refreshing trip to the baths, the next logical step in a Roman's day was to get dressed. And here again, the lives of slaves were intricately woven into the very fabric of Roman society. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman fashion was a powerful indicator of social status. You could tell a lot about a person just by looking at their clothing. The wealthy elite wore elaborate, brightly coloured togas and tunics made of fine linen and silk, while the working poor wore simple, coarse wool tunics. And what about the slaves? They were often given the simplest, most utilitarian clothing possible. They wore rough, undyed wool tunics, often with no sleeves, that served a purely functional purpose. The tunics were a drab and unmistakable uniform of their servitude, a visible sign of their social position. A quirky, and rather grim, tidbit is that the Roman agronomist Cato the Elder, the same guy who wrote about selling off old slaves, gave specific instructions on how much clothing to give to a slave per year. According to him, a slave should be given one tunic and a cloak every 2 years. If you think about the amount of hard labor they were doing, this was a meager allowance, and it shows just how little value was placed on their comfort or well-being. It was just enough to cover them and keep them from freezing in the winter, and not a stitch more. This is a bit like a modern-day company giving its employees one shirt to last them a whole year, which, let's be honest, would be a public health crisis waiting to happen. It was a cold, economic calculation, a way to minimize costs while maximizing labor. The role of slaves in Roman fashion wasn't just limited to wearing drab clothes. They were also the ones who made, cleaned, and mended the elaborate garments of their masters. There were enslaved tailors, laundresses, and a whole host of other specialized workers who ensured that their master was always immaculately dressed. This brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the skills of these enslaved people influence Roman fashion and art? Were the beautiful, intricate designs on a Roman toga the result of a master's artistic vision, or were they a reflection of the uncredited talent of the enslaved person who created them? The truth is, we will probably never know for sure, as the names of these enslaved artists and craftsmen were rarely recorded. The garment of a slave, a rough, simple tunic, was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of their status, a physical manifestation of their lack of freedom. It was a visual reminder, both to the slave and to everyone around them, that they were property, a tool of the trade, a person with no rights and no voice. The irony of a society that could produce such beautiful, complex art and clothing while simultaneously denying basic human dignity to the very people who made it is a testament to the profound contradictions of the Roman Empire. From the humble slave's tunic, we now move to a class of slaves who were the exact opposite of anonymous, the gladiators. These were the rock stars of the Roman world, men who lived and died in the arena for the entertainment of the masses. A mainstream historical fact is that most gladiators were slaves, bought for the express purpose of training and fighting, but they were not cheap. Their value depended on their physical prowess, their charisma, and their fighting skills. A newly acquired, untrained gladiator might fetch a few thousand sesterces, but a famous, experienced one, A man who had won a dozen fights could be worth a small fortune. They were the ultimate human commodity, an investment in spectacle and fame. The men who owned the gladiator schools, the Lanistae, were shrewd businessmen who knew that a single, successful gladiator could make them rich. A quirky tidbit that reveals the commercial nature of this business is that gladiators were often rented out for games. A Lanista wouldn't just sell his best fighters, he'd lease them to a wealthy Roman for a specific number of matches. The contract would even specify the price to be paid if the gladiator was killed in the arena, a kind of insurance policy for a human life. It's a bit like a modern-day professional sports team, but with much higher stakes and a much more literal sense of life and death. This is a very Roman concept, the idea that even a person's death could be part of a cold, economic calculation. The gladiatorial schools were a strange mix of brutal training grounds and high-stakes financial enterprises. The lives of gladiators bring up a fascinating and still open scholarly debate. To what extent did they have a choice in their destiny? While most were slaves, some free men chose to become gladiators, driven by debt, a love of fame, or a desire for a new life. This is a fascinating paradox, a free man choosing to enter a life of servitude and extreme danger. Did they see it as a chance for glory, a way to gain fame and fortune that they couldn't get as a free man? Or was it a last, desperate resort for those who had nothing left to lose? It's a question that gets at the heart of Roman society and its morbid fascination with violence and spectacle. For the enslaved gladiator, however, the choice was simple: fight or die. The fame and fortune that came with success were just a bonus. The real prize was staying alive. Gladiators were a paradox. They were both the most valuable of slaves and the most expendable. They were worshipped by the crowds and owned by their masters, living lives of both great fame and profound servitude. Their training was a grim process, a constant battle against injury and death, and their lives were a constant negotiation between their own will and the whims of their masters. The roar of the crowd, the flash of a sword, and the final gasp of a dying man, it was all part of the business, a dark and bloody reflection of the Roman soul. From the grim spectacle of the gladiator training school, we now move to the ultimate stage for life and death in the Roman world, the Colosseum. The games held here were not just about gladiators, however. They were a complex, multi-day spectacle that included animal hunts, public executions, and reenactments of famous battles. A mainstream historical fact is that these games, or ludi, were a key part of the Roman government's policy of bread and circuses, a way to keep the restless urban population content and distracted. The public wasn't just entertained by the violence, they were actively involved, cheering for their favourite gladiators, demanding a killer be spared, or shouting for a losing fighter to be put to death. The emperor, who sat in his private box, would often decide a gladiator's fate with a simple gesture, a thumb turned up for life or down for death. A quirky but telling tidbit is that the games were not just about pure entertainment. They also served as a kind of public forum for justice. Condemned criminals, many of them slaves, were often sentenced to die in the arena, either by fighting a wild animal or a more powerful gladiator. This was a form of public punishment, a way to show the masses the consequences of disobedience. This is a bit like a modern-day court case being broadcast on TV, but with a much more final and gruesome ending. The games, therefore, were a way to maintain social order and reinforce the absolute power of the state. It was a terrifying spectacle that was also a lesson in civics, a grim reminder of who was in charge. The sheer scale of the events brings up a fascinating, open scholarly debate. To what extent did Roman citizens genuinely enjoy these games? Were they simply conditioned to love them from a young age? Or did they have a kind of morbid fascination with violence? Some historians argue that the games were a reflection of the brutal Roman character, while others contend that they were simply a product of their time, a form of entertainment that we, with our modern sensibilities, cannot fully understand. It's a bit like trying to explain a modern video game to a Roman, you just wouldn't get it. But the fact remains that for hundreds of years, these games were a central part of Roman life, a grim reflection of a society that was both incredibly sophisticated and profoundly violent. For the gladiators themselves, the roar of the crowd was a daily reality, and for many, it was the last sound they ever heard. From the roar of the Colosseum, we move to a different kind of public spectacle, the act of execution itself. While some criminals and slaves died fighting in the arena, others faced an even more horrific fate: crucifixion. A mainstream historical fact is that crucifixion was a form of public execution primarily reserved for slaves, rebels, pirates, and those who were not Roman citizens. For a Roman citizen, being executed for a crime was usually done by beheading, a relatively quick and honorable death, but for a slave, it was the ultimate, dehumanizing punishment, a slow, agonizing public spectacle meant to terrorize and control. It was not just a punishment, it was a warning. The sight of a crucified body, left to hang for days or weeks, was a constant reminder of the consequences of disobedience. A quirky and deeply unsettling tidbit is that the Roman state used crucifixion so frequently that it had specialized executioners and even standardized crucifixion crosses. There were different styles of crosses, some shaped like a T and others like a regular cross. The condemned person would often be forced to carry the heavy crossbar to the site of their execution, a final, grueling act of humiliation before the final horror. It's a bit like a modern-day government making a criminal walk to the gallows while being taunted by the public, but in this case, the walk was much longer and more painful, and the final result was a protracted and excruciating death. The use of crucifixion brings up a fascinating open scholarly debate. To what extent did this kind of public terror actually work? Did it genuinely deter slaves and rebels from rising up, or did it simply breed more resentment and hatred toward the Roman state? The fact that massive slave rebellions, like the one led by Spartacus, still occurred even after thousands were crucified, suggests that the threat of death was not always enough to quell the desire for freedom. It seems that for some, the hope of a better life, or the simple desire for revenge, was more powerful than the fear of a horrible death. It was a grim calculus of defiance versus despair, and for many slaves, despair won out. The Roman government's use of crucifixion was a blunt and brutal instrument of control, a testament to the fact that for all its legal and social sophistication, the empire still relied on the most primitive form of terror to maintain its power. From the grim spectacle of crucifixion, we now turn our attention to one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, the Roman road network. These straight, well-paved arteries connected the entire empire, from the wild frontiers of Britain to the deserts of North Africa. A mainstream historical fact is that this vast network, over 250,000 miles of roads, was built almost entirely with slave labor. Imagine a massive army of enslaved people toiling under the hot sun, cutting through mountains and filling in swamps to lay the foundation for these roads. It was a brutal, physically demanding job, and the work was slow and meticulous. They would dig trenches, lay down layers of stone and gravel, and then pave the surface with carefully fitted stones. It was a testament to the fact that, for all of their engineering genius, the Romans still relied on the most primitive form of power, human muscle. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the Roman state had a special name for the slaves who worked on the roads, the servi publici. These were slaves who belonged to the state, not to a private master. Their lives were often even more difficult than those of domestic or agricultural slaves. As they were seen as completely expendable, they were often shackled together and forced to work in gangs, with no hope of ever gaining their freedom. This is a bit like a modern-day government having its own private workforce of prisoners, but with a much more final and brutal form of control. The Roman state's ownership of these slaves shows that the government itself was a major player in the slave economy, and it was not above using the most brutal methods to achieve its goals. The building of the Roman roads brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the existence of these slaves affect the speed of Roman expansion? Did the constant availability of cheap labor allow the Roman legions to push forward faster, knowing that a network of roads would follow in their wake? Or was the slow, methodical process of building the roads a major limiting factor? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The roads were a vital part of the Roman war machine, allowing for the rapid movement of troops and supplies, but they were also a constant drain on the human resources of the empire, a silent testament to the countless lives that were sacrificed to build them. The Roman roads are still with us today, in a way. You can still see their remnants in parts of Europe and the Middle East. They are a physical reminder of the power and ambition of the Roman Empire, and a grim testament to the fact that for every great Roman achievement, there was a human cost that was paid in blood and sweat. Just as the roads were a testament to the might of Roman engineering, so too were the aqueducts. those magnificent channels that brought fresh water to the heart of the Roman cities. A mainstream historical fact is that these immense structures, which spanned valleys and tunneled through mountains, were built almost exclusively by enslaved labor. The work was painstaking and dangerous. Slaves had to dig tunnels by hand, a dark and claustrophobic job with the constant risk of collapse. They had to quarry and transport the massive stone blocks used to build the arches, a feat of brute strength and endurance. The lives of these slaves were short and brutal, a grim sacrifice to the Roman thirst for clean water. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the Roman state often had a group of highly specialized slaves known as procuratores aquarum, who were responsible for the maintenance and management of the aqueducts. These were not the common laborers. They were highly skilled engineers and administrators who were still considered property. This is a fascinating paradox. The idea that a person could be a highly valued and skilled professional while still being legally owned by the state. It shows that for the Romans, slavery was not just about brute force. It was a system of control that encompassed every level of society, from the lowliest ditch digger to the most brilliant engineer. This is a bit like a modern company having its best and brightest employees on a special, non-standard contract that gives the company full ownership of their lives. The building of the aqueducts brings up a fascinating, open, scholarly debate. To what extent did Roman citizens understand the human cost of these incredible structures? Did they see the clean water flowing from the public fountains and simply not think about the enslaved people who died to build them? Or was there a kind of unspoken agreement to ignore the grim reality of the system? It's a question that gets at the heart of the moral compromises made by an entire society. It seems that for most Romans, the benefits of the aqueducts, clean water, sanitation, and public baths outweighed any moral qualms they might have had. The monuments to Roman engineering, so beautiful and enduring, are a silent testament to the countless lives that were sacrificed to build them. The Roman army, that engine of conquest and control, was not just made up of soldiers. It also relied heavily on enslaved people, who were an indispensable part of the war machine. A mainstream historical fact is that every Roman legionary was often accompanied by one or more slaves, who would carry their gear, cook their food, and perform other menial tasks. A slave was a kind of portable support system for a soldier, a grim fact of military life that allowed the Roman army to be a swift and efficient fighting force. These slaves, or colones, were not just the property of the soldiers, they were also a kind of property of the state, a vital part of the logistical chain that kept the legions supplied and on the move. Imagine an army marching into battle, not just with soldiers, but with thousands of enslaved people trudging behind, carrying the baggage and supplies. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that some slaves even served on the battlefield, though rarely as combatants. They were often tasked with carrying water, fetching supplies, and treating the wounded. They were in the thick of the action, but with none of the glory or the promise of plunder. And yet, for a lucky few, military service could be a path to freedom. A slave who distinguished himself in battle, perhaps by saving his master's life, might be granted manumission. This is a bit like a modern-day military awarding a medal to a civilian who helped out in a pinch, but in this case, the reward was a person's very liberty. The role of slaves in the Roman army brings up an open, scholarly debate. To what extent did the presence of so many enslaved people in the army weaken or strengthen it? Some historians argue that it made the army more efficient, as soldiers could focus on fighting without worrying about logistics. Others contend that it created a constant security risk, as a massive number of slaves, many of them recently conquered people, were a potential source of rebellion. The fact that the Roman army, for all its success, had to constantly worry about internal threats from its enslaved workforce is a testament to the fundamental instability of the Roman system. The very people who made the army so effective were also a potential threat to its existence. The Roman army, therefore, was a double-edged sword, a weapon of conquest that was also burdened by the immense human cost of its own success. From the grim practicalities of the army, we now turn to the spiritual side of Roman life. The cult of the emperor and the public religious ceremonies of Rome were an omnipresent part of daily life. A mainstream historical fact is that these rituals, from the great festivals to the private household sacrifices, were often managed and performed by enslaved people. A wealthy Roman family would have a special group of slaves whose job it was to tend to the family's shrines, or lauraria, and to ensure that all the proper rituals were carried out. These were often highly trusted slaves, as a religious misstep was seen as a grave omen. This is a bit like a modern-day family having a personal assistant whose main job is to make sure they get to church on time and that they don't forget to say their prayers. But in the Roman world, this assistant was legally owned by the family, a quirky but telling tidbit is that there were even slaves who were owned by temples themselves. These were the so-called servi publici sacri, or sacred public slaves, who were responsible for the maintenance of the temples, the tending of the sacred fires, and the performance of some of the more menial religious tasks. They were a peculiar class of slaves, as they belonged to the gods, in a sense, and not to a human master. This is a fascinating glimpse into the complex legal and social status of slaves in the Roman world. It shows that even in the realm of religion, the institution of slavery was a fundamental part of the system. The presence of slaves in these religious rituals brings up a fascinating, open, scholarly debate. To what extent did slaves develop their own spiritual lives that were separate from their masters? Did they genuinely believe in the gods they were forced to serve, or did they have their own secret beliefs? Perhaps a kind of underground religion that they practiced in private. The fact that many slaves came from conquered lands with their own gods and traditions suggests that there was a vibrant, if hidden, religious life among the enslaved population. This is a fascinating aspect of Roman history, one that shows that while a Roman master could own a person's body, they could not always own their soul. After exploring the Roman army and its use of enslaved people, let's turn to another engineering marvel that relied on their labor, the Roman sewer system. Specifically the Cloaca Maxima, or Greatest Sewer. This incredible piece of engineering, which still runs beneath Rome today, was a vital part of the city's sanitation. A mainstream historical fact is that it was built and maintained by a constant workforce of enslaved people. Imagine the job, wading through human waste and filth, in the dark and dangerous tunnels, to clear blockages and repair crumbling walls. It was a job so vile that it was often reserved for the most disobedient or ill-fated slaves. The conditions were horrific, and the work was a testament to the fact that even in its most mundane and disgusting tasks, the Roman Empire relied on the exploitation of human beings. A quirky, but telling tidbit is that the Cloaca Maxima was so large that a Roman general once rode a horse through it to inspect the work. The fact that a full-sized horse could fit in it shows just how massive an undertaking it was. But the general didn't do the work. Of course. The work was done by nameless, faceless slaves whose lives were spent in the dark and the muck. This is a bit like a modern-day CEO touring a factory and patting himself on the back for its efficiency, without ever thinking about the poor souls on the assembly line. The Roman sewer system, a symbol of Roman ingenuity, was also a symbol of Roman cruelty. The maintenance of the sewer system brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did Roman citizens understand the human cost of their sanitation? Did they see the clean streets of Rome and simply not think about the enslaved people who died to make it happen? Or was there a kind of unspoken agreement to ignore the grim reality of the system? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The sheer number of slaves in Rome meant that they were an invisible part of the landscape, a silent workforce that made daily life possible. The Roman sewer system, a beautiful piece of engineering, was also a dark and silent tomb for countless enslaved people. From the dark tunnels of the Cloaca Maxima, we move to a different kind of darkness, the world of enslaved children. The life of a child born into Roman slavery was a grim and uncertain one. A mainstream historical fact is that a child born to a slave mother automatically became a slave, regardless of the father's status. There was no such thing as an illegitimate child in the modern sense. The child was simply an extension of the mother's servitude. These children, known as vernae, were the property of their master from the moment of their birth, and their lives were dictated by the whims of the household. They were often put to work at a very young age, performing simple tasks like fetching water or running errands, a quirky but deeply unsettling tidbit is that Roman law made a distinction between a child slave and a baby slave. A baby was considered to be worth almost nothing until they were old enough to be put to work. This is a chilling glimpse into the cold, economic calculation that underpinned the entire institution. It's a bit like a modern-day farmer not counting a calf as part of the herd until it's old enough to be sold. The lack of value placed on an enslaved child shows just how little they were seen as human beings. Their worth was tied to their ability to produce labor, and until they could do that, they were simply an expense. The lives of child slaves bring up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did Roman citizens form emotional bonds with the enslaved children in their household? Did a Roman mother see a young slave child as a person to be nurtured, or as a future tool to be put to work? There are historical accounts of Roman women breastfeeding enslaved infants, but these are rare. More common were accounts of child slaves being treated as a kind of toy, an object of amusement to be discarded when they were no longer useful. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. But the fact remains that for every Roman child who had a carefree childhood, there were countless others who were born into a life of servitude with no hope of escape. The life of a child slave was a grim testament to the fact that for all of its sophistication, the Roman Empire was built on the foundation of human exploitation. The life of a Roman female slave was a unique and often more vulnerable experience than that of her male counterparts. A mainstream historical fact is that while male slaves were often used for heavy labor in the fields and mines, female slaves were primarily employed in domestic service, and their lives were often a mix of drudgery and danger. They were responsible for a wide range of tasks, from cooking and cleaning to spinning wool and weaving cloth. A wealthy Roman household would have a large contingent of female slaves, each with a specific role, from the ancilla, a general-purpose female servant, to the nutrix, a wet nurse who would care for the master's children. Their lives were often centered around the inner workings of the household, a world of constant labor and little privacy. A quirky and deeply disturbing tidbit is that female slaves were often used for the sexual gratification of their masters. There was no law protecting them from this, and the master's word was the final authority. This is a very grim reality of the Roman system, one that highlights the immense vulnerability of a female slave. A slave who became pregnant by her master was not granted any special status, and the child was simply born into slavery. This is a bit like a modern-day workplace where an employee can be exploited with no recourse, but with a much more intimate and violent form of exploitation. It was a constant threat, a grim part of a female slave's life that was often left unspoken. The lives of female slaves bring up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did Roman women, both free and enslaved, have a sense of solidarity? Did a Roman mistress see her female slaves as a kind of sisterhood, or as a collection of tools to be used and discarded? The historical record is a bit ambiguous. There are accounts of mistresses being cruel and violent, but there are also accounts of a kind of reluctant bond forming between a mistress and a long-serving slave. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. But the fact remains that for every free Roman woman who had a life of leisure and comfort, there was an enslaved woman whose life was a constant struggle. While a free Roman child might spend their days in a school learning rhetoric and philosophy, the life of a child born into slavery was a different story entirely. A mainstream historical fact is that the education of a slave was a pragmatic affair, designed to benefit the master, not the slave. A slave might be taught to read and write, not for their own enlightenment, but so they could act as an accountant or a scribe for their master's business. They might be taught a trade, like a cobbler or a stonemason, so they could increase their value and bring in more income for the household. The concept of education for the sake of knowledge was a luxury reserved for the Roman elite, a privilege of the freeborn. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that a master might be very proud of his educated slave, a kind of living status symbol. He might show off his slaves' knowledge at a dinner party, asking them to recite Greek poetry or solve a complex mathematical problem. It's a bit like a modern-day host showing off his expensive art collection. But in this case, the art could talk and was a human being. It was a bizarre and contradictory reality, a system that valued intellectual skills but denied the person who possessed them any real freedom. The education of slaves brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did this education lead to a sense of empowerment for the enslaved? Did a slave who could read and write feel a greater sense of worth? Or did it just make their life more difficult? The historical record is a bit ambiguous. There are accounts of slaves who used their education to write poetry and plays, but there are also accounts of slaves who used their knowledge to forge documents and escape their masters. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. But the fact remains that for a slave, education was a double-edged sword. It could be a path to a better life, but it was also a way to make them a more valuable piece of property. The Roman educational system, for all its sophistication, was a grim reminder that for many people, Knowledge was not power, it was simply a more efficient tool for their master. From the educated scribe to the lowly field hand, we now turn to a specialized class of slaves who held the power of life and death in their hands, the physicians. A mainstream historical fact is that many Roman doctors were slaves, often Greek or Egyptian, who had been captured and brought to Rome for their skills. A wealthy Roman family would have its own personal physician, a medicus, who was legally owned by the family but was given a great deal of respect and authority. These enslaved doctors were often highly educated, having studied in the medical schools of the Hellenistic world, and they were responsible for the health of the entire household, from the master to the lowliest kitchen slave. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that a slave physician was a much more common sight in a Roman home than a free one. This is a bit like a modern-day family having a live-in doctor who is a servant. It's a very strange juxtaposition, the idea of a person with such a valuable skill being legally owned by someone else. But for the Romans, it made perfect sense. A slave physician was a valuable asset, a person who could keep the master and his family healthy, and their skills were a source of great pride for the master. It was a kind of high-stakes investment, a bet that the slave would be able to keep the master alive and well. The role of the enslaved physician brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did Roman citizens trust these enslaved doctors? Did they see them as equals in skill, even if they were not equals in status? Or was there a kind of unspoken prejudice, a belief that a person who was legally property could not be truly trusted with a person's life? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The fact that many Roman doctors were slaves suggests that they were widely trusted, but there are also accounts of masters who were suspicious of their enslaved doctors. The Roman medical world was a strange and contradictory one, a world where a person could be a brilliant doctor and a piece of property at the same time. It's a powerful reminder that for all of its sophistication, the Roman Empire was built on the foundation of human exploitation. The life of a Roman slave was a constant negotiation with their master's whims, and their punishments for disobedience were swift and brutal. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman law, for all its complexity, was notoriously harsh on slaves. A master had the right to beat, torture, or even kill a slave with relative impunity. While later laws were passed to curb some of the most extreme cruelties, the power imbalance was immense. For a simple offense like breaking a clay pot or stealing a piece of bread, a slave could be whipped or branded with a hot iron. For a more serious offense, like theft or running away, the punishment could be crucifixion, a slow and agonizing public death. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is the use of a device known as a furca, a kind of wooden yoke that was placed around a runaway slave's neck. The furca was designed to be heavy and awkward, making it difficult for the slave to run and serving as a public symbol of their crime. It was a kind of portable shaming device, a physical reminder of their crime that they had to carry with them everywhere. It's a bit like a modern-day government making a criminal wear a sign that says, "I stole from my master." But in this case, the sign was a heavy piece of wood that made every step a misery. The punishments for slaves bring up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did this kind of public terror actually work? Did it genuinely deter slaves from rising up? Or did it simply breed more resentment and hatred toward the Roman state? The fact that massive slave rebellions, like the one led by Spartacus, still occurred even after thousands were crucified, suggests that the threat of death was not always enough to quell the desire for freedom. It seems that for some, the hope of a better life, or the simple desire for revenge, was more powerful than the fear of a horrible death. It was a grim calculus of defiance versus despair, and for many slaves, despair won out. The Roman government's use of punishment was a blunt and brutal instrument of control, a testament to the fact that for all its legal and social sophistication, the empire still relied on the most primitive form of terror to maintain its power. Having explored the dark realities of a slave's life, let's turn our attention to the place where a Roman master's life of luxury was most on display, the Roman villa. These country estates were not just houses, they were a complex, self-sufficient ecosystem, and they were run almost entirely by a vast workforce of enslaved people. A mainstream historical fact is that a wealthy Roman villa was a testament to the owner's status, and it was the slaves who built, maintained, and operated every aspect of it, from the gardens to the kitchens to the private baths. Every luxury was a product of enslaved labor. The owner of the villa could live a life of complete leisure, knowing that every detail, from the food on his plate to the temperature of his bathwater, was managed by a person who was his legal property. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the Roman villa was often a kind of a microcosm of the Roman world itself, with its own social hierarchy and its own set of rules. The slaves who worked in the main house, the familia rustica, were often a world away from the slaves who worked in the fields. The familia urbana, the domestic slaves, were often seen as having a better life, with more access to the master and a better chance of gaining their freedom. This is a bit like a modern-day company having different standards for its office workers and its factory workers. The villa was a place of luxury and beauty, but it was also a place of strict control and constant labor for the enslaved people who lived and worked there. The design of the Roman villa brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the architecture of these villas reflect the social and economic reality of slavery? Did the separation between the master's quarters and the slave barracks, for example, serve a social purpose, a way to keep the two worlds separate, or was it simply a practical necessity, a way to manage a large workforce? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, but the fact remains that the very design of the Roman villa, with its luxurious spaces and its hidden work areas, was a physical manifestation of the Roman social order. The Roman villa, therefore, was not just a house, it was a symbol of power, a monument to the Roman ideal of a life of leisure, an ideal that was made possible by the labor of countless human beings. From the heart of the empire, we now journey to its outer reaches, to the provinces, and we find that the institution of slavery, while a universal Roman reality, had a slightly different flavor depending on where you were. A mainstream historical fact is that while slavery in Rome and Italy was massive and highly structured, in the provinces, it often took on a more regional character. For instance, in the eastern provinces like Greece and Egypt, where there was a long tradition of slavery, the Roman system blended with the local customs. The result was often a more nuanced system, with a greater emphasis on skilled labor and a slightly more defined path to manumission for some slaves. In the rougher, more recently conquered provinces of the north, like Gaul and Britain, slavery was often more brutal and focused on raw physical labor in the mines and on the large agricultural estates. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the price of a slave could vary dramatically from province to province. A skilled Greek physician, for example, might be worth a fortune in a frontier town in Britain, where doctors were rare, while a captured British tribesman might be worth very little in a bustling city like Alexandria, where there was an abundance of cheap labor. This is a bit like a modern-day company paying different salaries to its employees in different countries, depending on the local cost of living and the availability of talent. The Roman slave market, therefore, was a global one, with prices and availability fluctuating based on supply and demand in different parts of the empire. The lives of slaves in the provinces bring up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did a slave's origin affect their treatment? Was a slave from a civilized province like Greece or Egypt treated better than a slave from a barbarian province like Gaul or Germany? The historical record is a bit ambiguous. There are accounts of masters who were particularly cruel to slaves from certain regions, but there are also accounts of masters who valued their slaves for their unique skills and knowledge. Regardless of their origin, the truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The life of a slave in the provinces was often more isolated and more dependent on the whims of their individual master, a kind of lottery that could either lead to a life of relative comfort or one of unceasing misery. The Roman Empire was a vast and diverse place, and the institution of slavery, for all its universality, was no exception. From the diverse provinces, we now turn our attention to the long, slow decline of slavery in the Roman world. A mainstream historical fact is that the reliance on massive slave labor began to wane in the later stages of the empire. This wasn't due to a sudden moral awakening, but rather to a number of complex economic and social shifts. As the empire stopped expanding, the supply of cheap captives from war dwindled. This is a bit like a modern-day company realizing it can't just keep opening new factories and has to figure out a new business model. The result was a rise in the price of slaves, making them a less economically viable source of labor, especially in the agricultural sector. Landowners began to experiment with new forms of labor, such as tenant farmers or colony, who were not slaves but were legally bound to the land. A quirky, but telling, Tidbit is that the Roman state even passed laws to encourage this new system. These laws, while not freeing the colony, did give them certain rights and protections that slaves did not have. It was a kind of proto-feudal system, a compromise between the absolute ownership of a slave and the complete freedom of a citizen. This is a great example of a society adapting to changing circumstances, not out of a sense of moral obligation, but out of a simple need to keep the economy from collapsing. It shows that for the Romans, economics often trumped ethics. The decline of slavery brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did this shift from slavery to a tenant farming system affect the Roman economy? Did it lead to a more stable, but less productive, agricultural system, or was it simply a natural evolution? A change that was bound to happen as the empire became more settled and less reliant on conquest. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The decline of slavery was a slow, gradual process, and it was tied to the larger social and economic changes that were transforming the empire. It was not a sudden revolution, but a long, slow fading of a way of life that had defined Roman society for centuries. The end of Roman slavery, therefore, was not a triumph of humanity, but a quiet concession to economic reality. From the complex economics of slavery, we now turn to a different aspect of Roman life, one that had a complicated and often contradictory relationship with the institution of slavery, early Christianity. A mainstream historical fact is that early Christians, while they did not openly call for the abolition of slavery, did challenge the Roman social order in a profound way. The Christian belief that all people were equal in the eyes of God, a concept that was utterly alien to the Romans, created a kind of spiritual paradox. A wealthy Roman might own 100 slaves, but in the eyes of the church, the lowliest of those slaves was his spiritual equal. This is a very powerful idea, a kind of radical egalitarianism that existed alongside one of the most brutal systems of human exploitation in history. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that there were many enslaved people who converted to Christianity, and many early Christian communities were made up of a mix of both free and enslaved people. The Christian apostle Paul, for example, wrote a letter to a Christian slave owner, urging him to treat his escaped slave not as a piece of property to be returned, but as a beloved brother. This is a bit like a modern-day pastor telling a CEO that their workers are not just cogs in a machine, but are also children of God. It was a very radical message for its time, one that challenged the very foundation of Roman society. The role of early Christianity in the Roman world brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the rise of Christianity lead to the decline of slavery? Some historians argue that the Christian emphasis on human dignity and equality played a key role in the long, slow fading of the institution. Others contend that the economic and social changes were far more important, and that Christianity simply adapted to the existing social order. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While Christianity did not lead to a sudden end to slavery, it did provide a powerful moral and philosophical challenge to the system. It was a kind of spiritual corrosion, a slow-acting acid that, over centuries, helped to dissolve the Roman ideal of human ownership. From the spiritual side of life, we now turn to a unique class of women who were both revered and, in a sense, enslaved by their religious duties, the Vestal Virgins. A mainstream historical fact is that these women were a powerful symbol of Roman piety and were given immense social status and privilege. They were the priestesses of the goddess Vesta, and their main duty was to tend to the sacred fire in the temple of Vesta. The fire was believed to be linked to the prosperity of Rome itself, and if it ever went out, it was a grave omen. Their life was one of immense honor, and they were the only women in Rome who were not under the legal control of a man. They were also immensely wealthy and lived in a kind of sacred seclusion, with their own servants and attendants. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that even the Vestal Virgins, for all their sacred status, had enslaved people to serve them. These were not just domestic slaves, they were a special class of slaves who were tasked with assisting the Vestals in their religious duties, from tending to the sacred fire to running errands. This is a fascinating paradox. The idea that a group of women who were legally free and socially powerful would still be reliant on a class of people who were legally owned. It shows that the institution of slavery was so deeply ingrained in Roman society that even its most sacred institutions could not exist without it. The lives of the Vestal Virgins and their enslaved attendants bring up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the sacred status of the Vestals affect the treatment of their slaves? Were the slaves of the Vestals treated with a special kind of reverence, or were they simply seen as a collection of tools to be used and discarded? The historical record is a bit ambiguous. There are accounts of Vestals who were kind to their slaves, but there are also accounts of them being cruel and violent. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. But the fact remains that for every Vestal virgin who lived a life of honor and seclusion, there was an enslaved person who was a constant, and often invisible, part of her life. From the quiet, sacred world of the Vestal virgins, we move to a different, but equally important, part of Roman life: art. A mainstream historical fact is that much of the beautiful art we associate with the Roman Empire, from intricate mosaics to stunning sculptures, was created by enslaved artists and craftsmen. These were not just laborers, they were highly skilled professionals who had a deep understanding of their craft. A master might own an entire workshop of enslaved artists, each with a specialized skill, from a sculptor who could carve a perfect bust to a painter who could create a stunning fresco. The very concept of a Roman master having his own personal artist, a living, breathing, and legally owned source of beauty, is a testament to the strange contradictions of the Roman system. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that some of these enslaved artists became quite famous in their own right. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder even mentions a few by name, a rare and important sign of recognition for an enslaved person. This is a bit like a modern-day art gallery having a masterpiece on display and then revealing that the artist was a person with no rights or freedom. It's a very strange juxtaposition. The idea of a person with such a valuable skill being legally owned by someone else. But for the Romans, it made perfect sense. An enslaved artist was a valuable asset, a person who could create beautiful objects that were a source of great pride for the master. It was a kind of high-stakes investment, a bet that the slave would be able to create art that was both beautiful and profitable. The role of the enslaved artist brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did these artists have a sense of their own artistic vision? Did they simply follow the master's orders, or did they have a kind of creative freedom that existed outside of their servitude? The historical record is a bit ambiguous. There are accounts of slaves who were given a great deal of artistic freedom, but there are also accounts of masters who were very strict about the content and style of their slaves' work. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The life of an enslaved artist was a constant negotiation between their own creative impulse and the demands of their master. It's a powerful reminder that for all of its sophistication, the Roman Empire was built on the foundation of human exploitation, even in its most beautiful moments, from the beautiful mosaics and sculptures. We now turn to a different kind of historical artifact, ancient documents known as papyri and ostraka. These were not works of art, but rather the mundane scraps of daily life, letters, contracts, shopping lists, and legal documents. A mainstream historical fact is that these seemingly insignificant documents have given historians a rare and intimate glimpse into the lives of enslaved people. While official Roman histories rarely mentioned slaves by name, these fragments of papyrus and pottery often contain their names, their jobs, and the small details of their lives. It's a bit like a modern-day historian finding a bunch of old text messages and sticky notes from a forgotten time period. They tell a story that the official record never would. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that some of these documents are a kind of sad testament to a slave's ambition. There are a number of papyri from Roman Egypt, for example, that are contracts for a slave to buy their own freedom, sometimes in installments. The contracts are a cold, legalistic document, but they represent a lifetime of scrimping and saving, a fragile hope that was put into writing. This is a powerful contrast to the grand monuments of Rome, which tell a story of power and conquest. The papyri and ostraka tell a more human story, a story of hope and despair, of small acts of defiance and quiet victories. The study of these documents brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent can we trust the story they tell? Are they a genuine reflection of a slave's life? Or are they a sanitized version of reality, a story that was meant to be seen by the master, not the slave? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, while we must be careful not to romanticize a slave's life. These documents provide a rare and valuable window into a world that was otherwise invisible. They give us the names and the stories of people who would otherwise be lost to history. They are a powerful reminder that for all of its vastness and power, the Roman Empire was made up of individual human lives, each with its own story to tell. After a slave was granted manumission, they entered a new and complex social arrangement known as patronage. A mainstream historical fact is that this relationship between a former master, now a patron, and a former slave, now a client, was a cornerstone of Roman society. The freedmen, for all their newfound freedom, was still legally and socially bound to their patron. The patron provided the client with protection, legal assistance, and economic opportunities. In return, the client was expected to be loyal, respectful, and, in many cases, to provide a certain number of days of service or labor to their patron each year. It was a kind of informal, but very real, continuation of the master-slave relationship. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the freedmen would often take on their former master's family name. This was a symbol of their new status and a public acknowledgement of the debt they owed. Imagine a modern-day employee being so grateful to their boss that they changed their last name to match theirs. It's a very strange idea. But in the Roman world, it was a normal part of the process. It was a way for the patron to show his generosity and power, and a way for the client to show their gratitude and loyalty. The institution of patronage brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did this relationship provide a genuine path to a better life for a freedman? Did it empower them to become successful, or did it simply trap them in a new kind of servitude? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While the patron-client relationship was a form of control, it also provided a crucial safety net for a freedman in a society where they had few legal rights. It was a way to navigate a complex and often hostile world. The lives of freedmen are a testament to human resilience and ambition, and the institution of patronage was a critical, if complicated, part of their journey. Just as the Roman roads and aqueducts were built by enslaved people, so too was the greatest symbol of the empire's power, the Colosseum. A mainstream historical fact is that this massive amphitheatre, which could hold up to 80,000 spectators, was built by a huge workforce of slaves and captured prisoners of war. The work was monumental. Imagine the sheer scale of the project. Millions of cubic feet of travertine stone had to be quarried and transported, and the entire structure had to be built from the ground up. This was not a job for a small team of engineers, it was a job for an army of labourers. The fact that the Colosseum was built in just 10 years is a testament to the immense human cost that was paid to build it. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the Colosseum's construction was paid for with the spoils of the Roman conquest of Judea. The Roman general Titus, the same man who would go on to become emperor, used the golden treasures from the sacking of Jerusalem to fund the project. This is a very grim reality. The idea that the greatest symbol of Roman entertainment was built with the plunder of a conquered people. It's a bit like a modern-day government building a massive stadium with the money from a war it just won. It's a perfect symbol of the Roman mindset, one that saw no contradiction in celebrating its power with a building that was paid for with the lives and suffering of others. The building of the Colosseum brings up an open, scholarly debate. To what extent did Roman citizens understand the human cost of this incredible building? Did they sit in the stands, cheering for a gladiator, and simply not think about the enslaved people who died to build the very seats they were sitting in? Or was there a kind of unspoken agreement to ignore the grim reality of the system? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The Colosseum was a marvel of Roman engineering, but it was also a monument to Roman cruelty, a grim reminder that for all of its beauty, the empire was built on the foundation of human exploitation. From the immense structure of the Colosseum, we now turn to the social policies that helped keep the masses content: bread and circuses. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman government, in an effort to prevent unrest and rebellion, provided free or subsidized grain and public entertainment to the urban poor. The games in the Colosseum, the chariot races in the Circus Maximus, and the distribution of free grain were all part of a cynical, but effective, strategy to keep the population from revolting for a restless and often unemployed urban population. A daily ration of grain and the thrill of the games were often enough to distract them from their lack of political power. It's a bit like a modern-day government offering free food and TV to keep the population from protesting. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that this policy had a profound and often grim effect on the lives of enslaved people. The massive demand for cheap grain to feed the urban poor meant that the agricultural latifundia had to produce more and more, which led to a constant and brutal cycle of slave labor. The free grain that a Roman citizen received was, in a very real sense, a product of the suffering of an enslaved person in the countryside. This is a very unsettling reality. The idea that a person's life of leisure was built on the back of another's misery. The policy of bread and circuses brings up an open, scholarly debate. To what extent did this policy actually prevent social upheaval? Did it genuinely keep the Roman people content, or did it simply create a kind of passive, apathetic citizenry that was easily controlled? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While the policy did not prevent all social unrest, it did help to ensure a kind of grim stability. It was a trade-off. The Roman people gave up their political power in exchange for a life of comfort and entertainment. The free grain and the gladiatorial games were a grim and bloody kind of social contract. A powerful reminder that for all its glory, the Roman Empire was built on the foundation of a very unequal society. From the circus, we turn our attention to the smallest unit of Roman society, the family, or familia. This wasn't just a simple mother-father-children unit. It was a complex social structure that was ruled by the pater familias, the eldest male in the household. A mainstream historical fact is that the pater familias had absolute legal authority over everyone and everything in his household, including his wife, children, and, of course, his slaves. He had the power of life and death over all of them, a chilling reality that shows just how unequal Roman society was. This is a very powerful idea. The thought that a person's life was not their own, but was a legal extension of the pater familias's will. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the legal status of children and slaves, while profoundly different, had some surprising overlaps. For example, in the early Republic, a pater familias could sell his children into slavery, a practice that was later outlawed. This is a bit like a modern-day parent having the legal right to sell their kids to a different family. A very strange and disturbing thought. It shows that the Roman concept of family was not based on love or affection, but on power and control. A child was a valuable asset, and in the eyes of the law, they were not all that different from a slave. The power of the pater familias brings up an open, scholarly debate. To what extent did this absolute legal authority lead to a kind of psychological bond between a master and his slaves? Did a slave feel a sense of loyalty to the family, or did they simply fear their master's wrath? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While the pater familias had the legal right to do whatever he wanted, the social reality was often more complex. A master who was kind and benevolent might be rewarded with a loyal and hard-working slave, while a cruel master might face constant rebellion and resistance. The Roman family, therefore, was not just a simple household, it was a battleground of power, a place where a person's life was constantly in flux, a negotiation between a master's will and a slave's desire for a better life. From the power dynamics of the Roman family, we now turn to a more abstract, but no less powerful, master of a slave's life, time. In the ancient world, there were no digital clocks or wristwatches, but time was a constant, and often cruel, master. A mainstream historical fact is that the Romans used a variety of methods to keep track of time, but the most common for public use was the clepsydra, or water clock. It was a simple device, a container with a small hole in the bottom that would slowly drain, and the level of the water would indicate the time. For a slave, the slow, agonizing drip of the clepsydra was a constant reminder of the hours they had left to work. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the Romans had a different system for dividing the day than we do. The daylight hours were divided into 12 parts, and the length of an hour would change with the seasons. A summer hour, when the sun was up for a long time, would be much longer than a winter hour. For a slave, this meant that the workday would be much longer in the summer, when the sun was out for more hours. It was a kind of grim, natural law that dictated the rhythm of their lives, a constant negotiation with the sun and the seasons. It's a bit like a modern-day employer telling their employees that they have to work longer in the summer, with no extra pay or compensation. It's a very strange and unequal system, one that was designed to get the most out of a slave's labour. The Roman concept of time brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did slaves have their own sense of time? Did they live by the sun, or did they have their own internal rhythm that was separate from their masters? The historical record is a bit ambiguous. There are accounts of slaves who were given a certain amount of free time, but these were rare. More common were accounts of slaves who worked from dawn until dusk, with no break in between. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, but the fact remains that for a slave, time was not a friend, it was a constant, and often cruel, master. From the abstract concept of time, we now turn to a very concrete and rather strange part of Roman cuisine, the snail. While we might think of snails as a kind of high-end French delicacy, for the Romans, they were a common, and often farmed, food. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman elite had a kind of morbid fascination with snails and would often have their own snail farms, or cochlearia, which were run by enslaved people. These farms were not just for collecting snails, they were for fattening them up, sometimes with a special diet of milk and wine, to make them larger and more flavorful. It's a very bizarre, but telling, part of Roman gastronomy, a quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the Roman author Pliny the Elder wrote about a man who became rich from his snail farm. The fact that a person could become wealthy from something as strange as snail farming shows just how much money was being thrown around in the Roman world, but the person who did the actual work, the person who cleaned the snails and fed them their rich diet, was a slave. It's a bit like a modern-day CEO becoming rich from a company that sells fancy bottled water, while the person who fills the bottles with water makes minimum wage. It's a very strange juxtaposition, the idea of a luxury product being made by a person who was legally owned. The Roman snail brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the existence of so many enslaved people affect the Roman diet? Did the constant availability of cheap labor lead to a more varied and complex cuisine? Or did it simply make the Roman diet more reliant on the things that could be produced with human muscle? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The Roman diet, for all its exoticism, was still very reliant on the things that could be grown and harvested by enslaved people. The Roman snail, therefore, was not just a food, it was a symbol of Roman inequality, a grim reminder that for every Roman who had a life of luxury, there was an enslaved person who was a constant and often invisible, part of their lives from the living world of snail farms. We now turn to the final journey of a Roman slave, death and burial. A mainstream historical fact is that a slave, even in death, was still legally the property of their master. This meant that a master had the right to decide how a slave was buried, and the rituals were often a stark contrast to those of a free Roman. While a wealthy Roman would be buried in an elaborate sarcophagus in a private tomb, a slave was often buried in a common plot. Often with other slaves, the tombstone, if there was one, would often list the master's name, a final, grim reminder of their legal status. It's a very unsettling thought, the idea that a person's identity was so tied to their owner that even in death, they were still just an object to be accounted for. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is the existence of columbaria, or large communal tombs that were often built for a Roman family's slaves and freed people. These were often large, circular rooms with niches in the walls where a person's ashes would be placed. This is a bit like a modern-day company building a kind of cemetery for its employees. It was a very strange juxtaposition, the idea of a family providing a kind of community for its enslaved people, but only in death. It shows that for some masters, there was a kind of grudging recognition of their slaves' humanity, but it was a recognition that came with a price. The Roman funerary rites bring up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did slaves have their own burial clubs or rituals? Did they have their own secret ceremonies that were separate from their masters? The historical record is a bit ambiguous. There are accounts of slaves who were members of burial clubs, which were a kind of mutual aid society that would help a person get a proper burial. This is a fascinating glimpse into the underground social networks of the enslaved population, a world that existed in the shadows of the Roman Empire. It shows that even in death, slaves found ways to forge a sense of community and personhood. We've explored the world of Roman slavery in all its grim detail, from the marketplaces to the mines. But let's return to the source of so much of this misery, the latifundia. A mainstream historical fact is that these massive, Slave-run agricultural estates were the engine of the Roman economy. They were the private kingdoms of the Roman aristocracy. Vast tracts of land that were worked by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of chained and miserable slaves. The sheer scale of these farms is mind-boggling. They were not just for growing food, they were a symbol of a Roman's wealth and power. The more slaves you had, the more land you could acquire, and the more land you had, the more powerful you became. It was a vicious cycle that fueled the Roman economy and cemented the power of the elite. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the Romans had a number of different types of agricultural slaves, each with a specialized role. There were the rustici, or rural slaves, who did the heavy labor in the fields, but there were also the vicarii, or sub-slaves, who were a kind of second-tier slave that a master allowed a senior slave to own. This is a very strange and unsettling reality. The idea of a slave owning a slave. It shows just how deeply ingrained the concept of ownership was in Roman society. Even a slave could participate in the system of human exploitation. The existence of the latifundia brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did these massive farms lead to the decline of small, independent Roman farmers? Did the constant availability of cheap, slave-run grain and produce drive the small farmers out of business, leading to a massive social and economic shift? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The rise of the latifundia was a complex social and economic change, and it was tied to the larger forces that were transforming the Roman world. It was a kind of proto-industrial farming, a system that was incredibly efficient, but also incredibly brutal. The latifundia, therefore, were not just farms, they were a perfect symbol of Roman power, a testament to the fact that the empire was built on the foundation of human misery. We've seen the gladiator and the craftsman, but there was another place where a slave might find themselves side by side with their master, the Roman army. A mainstream historical fact is that a Roman soldier was often accompanied by a slave who would carry his gear, cook his food, and perform other menial tasks. A soldier's life was a difficult and often lonely one, and a slave was a kind of portable support system, a grim but necessary part of the Roman war machine. This is a very strange juxtaposition. The idea of a soldier fighting for the freedom of the Roman state while being accompanied by a person who was legally owned. A quirky, but telling, tidbit is that the Roman army even had a kind of official policy for what to do with a captured slave. A general who captured an enemy slave could, in some cases, sell them back to their master for a fee. This is a very bizarre, but telling, reality. The idea that a person's body was a kind of currency to be traded and sold. It shows just how deeply ingrained the concept of ownership was in Roman society. Even in the chaos of war, the rules of ownership still applied. The role of slaves in the Roman military brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the presence of so many enslaved people in the army weaken or strengthen it? Some historians argue that it made the army more efficient, as soldiers could focus on fighting without worrying about logistics. Others contend that it created a constant security risk, as a massive number of slaves, many of them recently conquered people, were a potential source of rebellion. The fact that the Roman army, for all its success, had to constantly worry about internal threats from its enslaved workforce is a testament to the fundamental instability of the Roman system. The very people who made the army so effective were also a potential threat to its existence. We've journeyed through the grim landscape of Roman slavery, from the bustling marketplaces to the brutal mines, and we end our journey where it all began, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. A mainstream historical fact is that the institution of slavery was a fundamental part of the Roman economy and society for centuries, and its eventual decline was tied to the larger forces that were transforming the empire. As the Roman Empire stopped expanding, the supply of cheap, enslaved labor dwindled. This is a bit like a modern-day company running out of raw materials. It has to find a new way to do business. The result was a slow, gradual shift away from slavery and toward a new system of tenant farming. This was not a moral triumph, but a quiet concession to economic reality, a quirky, but telling, tidbit is that even in its final years, the Roman Empire still clung to the institution of slavery. The last recorded slave sale in the Western Roman Empire was in the 5th century AD. a grim testament to the fact that the Roman way of life, for all its sophistication, was built on the foundation of human exploitation. This is a very unsettling reality, the idea that even as the empire was crumbling, it was still buying and selling human beings. It shows that for the Romans, the institution of slavery was not just a part of their economy, it was a part of their very identity. The end of the Roman Empire brings up an open scholarly debate. To what extent did the reliance on slavery lead to the empire's eventual downfall? Some historians argue that the reliance on cheap labor stifled innovation and made the economy brittle and unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Others contend that the empire's decline was due to a number of complex factors, from barbarian invasions to political instability, and that slavery was simply a symptom of a much larger problem. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The institution of slavery, for all its power and economic benefits, was a moral and social rot that permeated the Roman Empire. It was a cancer that, over centuries, helped to weaken the very foundations of the Roman world. And so, we end our journey, not with a roar, but with a whisper. The Roman Empire, for all its power and glory, was a testament to the fact that a society built on the back of human exploitation is a society built on a fragile and ultimately unsustainable foundation. And now, the long march of history gives way to a final calm, as we reach the end of our journey, and you can let your thoughts drift, like dust motes in the evening light. All the facts and figures, the lives and the miseries, can fade away now. The long, brutal march of history has come to an end for tonight, and all you have to do is rest, let your mind settle, and feel the weight of a long, long day just lift away. The air around you is calm and still. There's nothing more to do, nothing more to think about. Just peace, just rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.